Kia ora everyone, my name is Hamish Rogers. I'm Sport Development Consultant with Sport New Zealand. I'm normally the man behind the scenes with the Balance is Better website. You won't have to look at my mug too long. I'm going to get out of the way and let all the bright guys in front of us get into what is going to be a riveting chat tonight. So welcome to our Balance is Better webinar tonight. Our kaupapa tonight is going to be looking and talking about the relationships between athletes, coaches and parents, and how we can go about building better relationships between what is probably the key triumvirate in sport, but particularly youth sport. And what we'll do just to kind of settle our kaupapa tonight is we'll start with the Sport NZ karakia. And then once we're kind of through that, I'm going to hand it over to Dave Wright, who will be the man in shining lights tonight, hosting us and navigating us through, as I said, what is going to be a riveting conversation. Before I do get into the karakia, for those who are joining us tonight for the first time on this webinar and haven't heard about Balance is Better, have a look through the website and I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse. But in short, Balance is Better is Sport New Zealand's philosophy around youth sport. And it's about making sure all young people have the opportunity to have quality experiences in youth sport and so fall in love with youth sport and continue to love youth sport for the entirety of their lives. Without further ado, our Sport New Zealand karakia, te taua mai I ranga, te taua mai I raro, te taua mai I roto, te taua mai I waho, kia tau ai te Māori tū, kia tau ai te Māori ora, tū whakamaua kia tina, humie, huie, tai kia.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, this is my time to exit left. I'm going to hand it over to you, Dave. I'll let you do the round of intros and have fun.
Thank you, Hamish, and great to see so many people pouring in from different parts of not only the New Zealand system, but of course around the world. We've got people from South Africa, Australia, and others I've seen jumping onto the call. So really pleased to see so many people here. I know the interest has been good regarding this particular webinar. So a little bit of housekeeping before I get into introductions. Obviously, as Hamish has pointed to, do feel free to use the chat box. So utilize that space to ask questions, to discuss things with others in the room, share your thoughts as to what you hear. We will try and get to as many questions on the run as possible. Feel free to challenge ideas, make suggestions, and as I say, we'll do our best to get to you. Hamish will be in the background helping with technical support. And so if you do have any issues in that regard, you can, if Wi-Fi fails you or if the webinar software fails for any reason, you can log back in on the link that you came in previously, which is obviously in your email. Do look out for more webinars coming up through the Balance is Better community. We have another one in a couple of weeks, which is going to be a really good discussion on game management and game day. I believe you can register for that, and if it's not out already, you will see some promotion around it. I know there are further webinars throughout the year in the mix for Sport New Zealand as well. So really pleased to be here on behalf of the Balance is Better community. So in terms of who we are tonight, I don't want to talk too much because my job is to really dive into the minds of two top experts that we've managed to bring in for this discussion. First of all, I'd like to throw to Dr. Craig Harrison. Craig's become a really good friend. He's somebody who I have a huge amount of respect for in the athlete development space. Craig, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Kia ora, Dave, and to everybody tuning in. I'm excited to get stuck in, so thanks for having me.
Awesome. And also beaming in from San Diego, very late at night, Reed, I want to give you a shout out. It's 11 p.m. or after 11 p.m. there now where you are. And I know you've been super excited to get involved with the Sport New Zealand community. Reed Maltbie is somebody who I've been very lucky to connect with over the last few years through Player Development Project. And he's contributed a huge amount of resource to that and is a real influencer in the youth development space. Reed, welcome. And thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. It's like Christmas morning.
Excellent. Well, look, I want to get a little bit of information about you guys. So in 60 seconds or so, can you give us a bit of background on yourself, Craig, your experience and the work that you're doing in the youth space?
Yeah, first and foremost, I'm a dad. So I think that's important to lead with. I've got three kids, the 3, 8, and 9. So keeping us busy. So yeah, that's really my number one passion. And then on the side of being a dad, I I work in the athlete development space and juggling a few balls at the moment, which is really exciting. I enjoy working across lots of different spaces. And so really for me, it's working with athletes. So I actually support some athletes directly, and that's across the physical and the mental skills space. So I'm really interested in the holistic support that we can put around some aspiring young people in sport. And on top of that, I've got a research role at AUT, and I've got a group of postgraduate students, and we specifically dive into all things youth sport. And at the minute, we're doing some really juicy research in the parent space, which is super cool. So that's coming through with some really nice findings that hopefully we'll be able to share in the not too distant future. And then I do workshops and keynotes and with organizations, with schools, with sports, just really to think about what in good nutritious environments look like from that point of view. So it keeps me busy.
Well, I do highly recommend that anyone in the room checks out Craig's work and tune into the Athlete Development Show. It's a great podcast, and I like to jump on there from time to time and have a few chats with Craig and all things development. Thank you so much, Craig. And Reid, a little bit about your story. As I said to everyone, I've known you for a few years, and it's really been enjoyable to collaborate with you. But can you tell us about your story in the sport landscape?
Certainly. I was a soccer player myself, football player, and got into coaching at 16 years old. So I've been doing it over 30 years now. I've got a master's degree in sports psychology or sport performance, and one in early childhood education. And those two degrees really shape how I approached learning behaviors, learning environments, and then also how I approached just an interaction with the athletes. For the last decade almost, I've been very similar to Dr. Harrison. I've been doing a lot of work in team settings, group settings, keynotes, consulting, workshops. And my areas that I typically am passionate about are language learning and leadership. And how do those three areas affect high performance environments, high stress environments? And my other role, I'm also a father myself, a little bit older. I've got one left in the nest. The other two have flown. And in my daytime job, I'm executive director of the Intercollegiate Sailing Association. So I work with 200 plus sailing teams in the U.S., which is not a sport I ever played, but it's been an absolute blast working with them.
Awesome. It's great to hear more about your work. And again, recommend that people check out Reid's various content online. A little bit about myself. I am Dave Wright, co-founder of Player Development Project. We're very grateful and very excited to constantly be working with Sport New Zealand around Balance is Better. I am definitely a football coach in terms of a big part of my identity is being a coach. And I've worked abroad in clubs like Fulham, Brentford, and over at Melbourne Victory as well. Came home to New Zealand about 3 years ago after 12 years away, and did some work at High Performance Sport New Zealand for 2.5 years. Similar to these guys, I'm a dad of two very small boys, so we're right in the grind of dealing with toddlers and babies and all of those things. As I say, Player Development Project is what keeps me really busy alongside some coaching commitments locally. So with all of that said, we want to get into the conversation. And again, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we had a bit of a conversation leading into this webinar that we didn't want to go down the death by PowerPoint kind of route. So what we're doing here is showing the last slide we hope to show you. And then we're going to get into a bit of a panel discussion where, again, I'm going to try and get some great insight and information out of these guys, and we'll tackle your questions. So the three big topics tonight: the coach is the leader, how the coach can impact positive relationships, unification and collaboration, everyone coming together, and how that benefits athletes. And then we'll try and wrap it up with some discussion around communication and common language. I know an area, as Reid mentioned, he's very passionate about, and some practical tips to ensure that alignment between athlete, parent, and coach. So we're going to try and take down the slides and just have a discussion, gents. To kick things off on the first topic, the coach is the leader. Craig, I want to go to you. Where does this topic start in terms of the coach's role in trying to, navigate the challenges of their key stakeholders in the form of the child, the athlete, and the parent, who obviously have a real interest in their child's sport?
Yeah, the more and more these days, I'm spending time thinking about a really important question. And that question is, what is it for? And so more and more discussions with coaches and with the organizations that they spend time and trying to understand what that question really means. and I really believe that the coach is the architect of the environment, and therefore the behaviors that show up in that environment. So I think that answering that question, what is it for, and having real clarity from a values and behaviors point of view is super interesting. And I think that's a key point that we need to spend some time trying to understand, whether it's going into the start of a season, or whether that's a group of coaches that fall under a larger organization, is to spend some time really discussing the answer to that question.
Reid, for you, any thoughts on the coach as the leader to kick things off?
Yeah, I would agree. The coach is sort of the standard bearer. And what we need to understand is that we are collaborators in this process with not just the athletes, but the parents on this journey. And if we do it right, we can work together to create the very best environment. But we have to drive that. And we need to communicate early and often. Don't be afraid to set rules of engagements of, what are the easiest ways to communicate, how, when, what type of topics we can discuss. And then also, my big thing was as the coach was, if I was constantly communicating with the parents and letting them know why we were doing the things we were doing, then they wouldn't answer those questions on their own, because sometimes they're on the other sideline trying to figure out what we're doing. And if I'm ahead of time telling them, we're not going to punt, we're going to play out of the back, or we're going to work on this week, so you'll see a lot of this, then they weren't filling in the blanks. They had already filled in the blanks for them, and they became partners in that process, allies, rather than trying to figure out what I was doing as a coach. So that's really where the leadership of a coach comes in, is helping fill in those blanks.
We're probably, I guess we're at the start of a winter season in New Zealand. You've both sort of alluded to the coach setting the environment. Reid, you've talked about the standard bearer, which I really like. What do you guys think when it comes to the take on setting standards and expectations, potentially the culture around the group, and whether the role of player ownership in there? Because for me, that there is an opportunity at the start of every season to be very clear in terms of expectations, both to players in our care and the parents who are involved. And at times we miss that opportunity.
Yeah, if I could share a story, and this happened 2 nights ago. I was speaking just at a local school in Auckland, and a year 13 came up to me at the end of the conversation, and I spent some time really talking about setting the culture. And she was really curious and asked a really poignant question, I thought, around, she was the captain of the team, and they'd lost a bunch of year 13s from the team as the year ticked over into 23. And she really was curious around what she could do alongside her coach to set the environment so that the girls had a great experience. And I thought that was a really great question. And we talked about essentially the expectations and what is it for, and what the girls wanted out of the experience, and to do that early. And so it was really cool to hear from someone that was in the mix of it and wanting to give it a crack.
Reid, for you, any thoughts on that one? I love the initiative. That's the thing that's coming through to me. I sometimes, that perhaps the cynic in me thinks that initiative is an attribute that's disappearing. And perhaps that can be a reflection on environments where coaches might not enable that to happen. So again, we've got to look at ourselves before we look at our athletes. But any thoughts on that, or any other thoughts around the coach in terms of setting that culture and the opportunities at the start of the year?
Sure. One, you're right. We can set that environment so that they feel comfortable coming forward and being assertive and asking those kinds of questions. And I love the fact that Dr. Craig was talking about the age, because they're never too young to empower athletes to have control of this process. If they're the ones driving the process, we can help them navigate. We can provide the tools and resources, but they're going to be far more committed and passionate about the sport if it's theirs, if they own it. And so when I said we're the standard bearers, or that we set the tone, one of the things that we always try to do with our teams is our athletes would actually set the goals for the season and would set the values for the team and would set up, all of those pieces of the puzzle. We'd work with the athletes, and then we would be the ones that would convey it to the parents that, hey, this is theirs. They created this, and I'm just letting you know about it. And I'm going to be the one that's going to carry that banner for them. And I don't become that nagging guy that's always pointing out the things that they're doing wrong or whatever. I become that accountability partner. Remember what we agreed on at the beginning of the season. Are we holding to that standard? And now they're the ones that feel that responsibility for it because it was theirs in the first place.
I like that.
There's a great story from a guy, Owen Eastwood. If you haven't read Owen's book, Belonging, then I highly recommend you pick it up. And I was lucky enough to have him on my podcast not that long ago. And he really nicely articulated this idea of people are going to bring their own values. And one thing I've come to understand is that I don't have the right to tell someone what they value because they've had a lived experience and what they value is what they value. But what Owen talked about was this really nice coming together of values and creating space for our young people to share their story. And Owen talks a lot about whakapapa and how understanding where we've come from, be it a team or be it individuals, is really powerful to help us move forward, in the same direction. And so if we can spend time bringing and sharing our own values and then deciding on some of the things that the team can share, I think that's a really powerful way of bringing people together. So highly recommend this book. It's really cool.
Absolutely. So we've obviously talked about players setting some standards, handing some ownership over to them. Where does the link come in this process where we're bringing parents into the loop? I know, Reed, you talked about communicating and you've referenced the challenges of being on the opposite sideline at times to the coach. We've all been there where that anxiety can build. Parents will talk to each other. Questions can be asked if they're not clear on what's actually happening on the pitch. But if we're talking about that early season kind of example, at what point are we bringing parents into this and sort of, I guess, illustrating some of the ideas that the athletes have come up with?
From the very beginning, set the tone from the very start. Usually have that parent meeting to kick off the season. And then in there, you can explain that, hey, the athletes are going to be the ones driving this process. We're going to work with them. We're going to set the values, or they'll be their values. We're going to set the goals for the season. I'll help guide them. And then right away, you're telling them, we're going to communicate. These are our rules of engagement. This is the easiest way to communicate with me. These are the things that we can talk about. And oh, by the way, I'll communicate regularly with you. And so from day one, you've created that relationship with the parents. The problem that we typically have in the States here is that there is this us versus them mentality that occurs where coaches don't want to deal with parents and parents don't like the coaches. And so they stand on opposite sidelines and they never come together. And a lot of coaches won't interact with the parents. So you're already setting that defensive posture with them. So ours was always embrace the parents from the very beginning. That's the one thing the schools in the US do really well is the teachers are constantly sending home, read to your kids at night. Here's what we worked on this week. Talk to them about their hunks and chunks letters, or talk to them about their vowel sounds and things like that. And so they're bringing the parents into the learning process. As a coach, if day one you have a conversation with the parents where you say, this is our process to work on together. I'm a professional, just like you are in your role. So trust me as a professional, but we'll work together to create the best environment possible, because it doesn't just stop at the field. It happens in the car rides. It happens at the kitchen table. These conversations and the reinforcement of the culture and the values and actually of the skills being learned on the field happen all the time. So day one, if you're having that conversation with the parents, they have a role to play now. They feel like they're invited into the classroom.
Yeah.
I love it, Reed, and here's why. This is why I love this so much, because when we flip the narrative on what it means to coach, and we think to ourselves, what can I do in the time that I do spend with my athletes that's going to influence the time when they're not here, right? And by the way, you might get 3, 4, 5, depending on the level and the sport, hours a week with your athletes. So there's plenty of hours when they're not around. And who's the designer of those environments where kids spend almost half, if not more, of their time? It's the parent. And so there's real opportunity in it. And if we think about coaching in a different way, then all of a sudden we can do some really magical things.
I totally agree with you. I love it, because that's like, you can give parents talking points. You get done with a game and you can talk about what went well and what you're going to work on in the coming week. And by the way, ask Johnny about X today. Like, why did we work on X during the game? And now, instead of it in the car ride home, rehearsing every mistake they made, they're having a meaningful conversation where their kid is teaching them. And yeah, I absolutely love the idea of bringing them in. And you're right. They spend a lot more time around their kid than we do. So why aren't we working together on it?
Mm. I love the idea. I think that car ride home is a big issue. I know there's a number of influencers in the space and experts in the space who have written about this. I love the analogy from John Haim, who's a Canadian sports psychologist who's former professional golfer himself. And he sort of works in as a consultant and sports psychologist over there in a variety of sports. He talked about the minivan prison and the role that we can play as parents post-game when at times kids might just want to decompress. They might not want to talk about their performance. And so going back to the coach perspective is, I think there's a duty of care, whether it's coaches or leaders within clubs and organizations, to really drive that parent education piece. So we're talking obviously about, linking parents in and making sure they're included, but ensuring that they are regularly in contact with us and understanding what we're trying to achieve so that they can then support those objectives, for me, is a massive one here. Have you guys got examples, I guess, of, a concerted strategy or a regular form of contact around this parent education piece?
Go ahead, Doctor.
Dave, just state the question again. Like, what exactly are we?
Well, in terms of we can bring people in, but in terms of driving that kind of education and consistently trying to keep people aware as to what we're trying to achieve. So if I'm working with young players and they've got objectives in the game, to reduce that anxiety, I want those parents to know what those objectives are, right? We've talked about that transparency. So, but for me, that's a constant education, because at times it can melt away during the season when suddenly results might come into focus or performances might be questioned. And then it's back to the sort of same old conversations in the car, So I guess the question is around how often do we need to be engaging? Reed talked about bringing people in regularly, but I think there's got to be that constant education. Any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I go back to relationships, and there's a couple of questions in the chat around engaging disengaged parents. The first thing I would say is that's a huge challenge, because if parents aren't showing up in the space, or if you're not having an opportunity to actually relate, then you can't build a relationship. And all good things come out of relationships. And so let me tell how I think about this through a story. And it was at AUT Millennium when we were running our LTID, our long-term athlete development program, where our job was to bring kids in and give them an experience around the physical and the mental sides of the game. So we had kids from all sorts of sports of all different levels, all different shapes and sizes. And what we came to understand as a group of coaches, a slightly different way of doing things that increase the gap. And I think about this gap between expectation and reality. So parents will always come with an expectation of what they think they're going to see. I mean, and that, again, it's built through their experiences.
Yeah.
And then when they see the reality, if there's a big gap between that, then that creates uncertainty. And we all know that no one likes to feel uncertainty. And there's certain ways that people, human beings, not just parents, will try and close that gap. And so what we did was we spent a lot of time sitting with our parents, and we were lucky enough to be able to create the space. We were coaching as a team, and so I removed myself from the direct coaching of the kids, and we set up a coffee group in the morning and invited the parents in. A lot of them were coming to watch regardless, and so that was an opportunity to actually pull them into a group and to just share some of the things that they were seeing and let them ask questions, all in an attempt to reduce the gap between their expectations and the reality of what they were seeing, because there was a lot of chaos in the environment. Kids were doing some really different things around building movement skills, and it just didn't look normal. It didn't look like there was much learning happening. And I think in today's age, we're living in a world where outcomes have become the priority. And there's pressure all around on all of us as parents to want to see our kids progressing. And when we don't see that happening, then we start to ask questions. And so really I think the best way to approach it is actually to narrate what they're seeing and try and help them to actually see it through a different set of eyes.
Reid, anything to build on there?
Yeah, two quick stories. One, because I started at such a young age, I'm 18, 19 years old in college, and I'm coaching teams, youth teams, that I got into this habit of trying to justify my existence as a young kid coaching these. So I would, after every game, would cross the field and talk to the parents in the beginning, just to prove that I was capable of doing this, so that they trusted me. And then I, at one point, finally stopped, and one parent reached out to me and said, "Hey, we'd actually like when you do that. Can you keep debriefing with us?" And so that became a habit, was always crossing that field and debriefing. Like Dr. Craig was saying, the narrative is constantly happening, having those meaningful conversations. So I wasn't just talking to the kids, I was engaging the parents, and I was narrating the game for them. This is what went down. This is what we worked on. We saw some things we worked on in practice this week. Next week, we'll be working on this. And by the way, like I said, talking points. The other thing is we stumbled on it by accident, but we had this team, and I was working with another coach who was out of the English Premier system. He was out of the academies. And so he was raised completely different on the game than I was, in a completely different environment. So we approached the game so very different. And because of that, the parents weren't sure who to listen to, how to follow, how to interact with us. And Mark, brilliant as he was, one day turns to us and says, we're having a Saturday morning kick around with the boys. He said, "How about we invite the parents to play?" So we had a pickup game with a bunch of 9-year-olds and their parents. And some of them had played and some of them hadn't. And some of them just wanted to stand around and not really do much, which was fine. But what it did was, while we were doing that, we were able to have meaningful conversations about, we just worked on that last week. Did you see that movie did? And the one parent who played soccer way back in high school said, "I forgot how difficult this is. Like, I've been so hard on my son because he couldn't do a particular skill. And then I forgot how difficult this is to do." And so not only were we able to do that every Saturday and have those conversations and keep the parents in the loop and engage them and give them a role to play, but then they gained a total respect for their kids, and they sat back and became fans rather than parents of their kids' games, which was really cool to see.
Yeah, that's a nice shift. Look, I think the other thing to consider in all of this, I know there's been a question in the room about, John mentioned the parent that's not quite engaged. Tani's talked about how do we encourage parents to be involved when they appear quite absent or uninterested. I think, Reid, the example you've used there might be a great strategy around trying to engage and trying to get people to connect. But do either of you have any thoughts on that? If there is somebody who's particularly absent or disinterested in what their child is up to at sport, is this a negative thing, or is it just something that is going to come up as much as we might get the anxious or stressed out parent?
Yeah, a lot of times it's that whole, you just don't know what people are going through. I think most of the experiences I had with those parents who were disengaged or reticent, there was either a lot going on in their world, or they'd had a past experience that was negative, and so they're purposely withdrawing to not go through that again. And so, as I told John, maybe there's an opportunity to give them a role. You're the team photographer, you're the team statistician, something that's, they feel like they're involved. And it's taking that time to build that trust with them, because if they've had a bad experience with a past coach or in the sport itself, it's going to take time for them to warm up to you. If they're just fully disengaged because it's just, they're not engaged in their kids' sport experience, or there's a ton other things going on at home, then my goal is always to not make it feel like there's an absence to those kids and to that particular child. Yeah. Like, I don't even make a big deal out of it, because I don't want that kid to start thinking, well, why is so-and-so's parent coming and not mine, or why? So I just seamlessly just act like it's not a big deal. And I sort of, I always had team parents that were like the team mom or team dad who helped organize things. And I always asked them to keep an eye out, and if they got a chance, talk to that parent for me and see what's going on, reach out. And because it's much easier sometimes coming from a peer than it is from the coach to reach out and ask.
Yeah, I like that, Reid. I think opportunities or invitations to engage in lots of different spaces and in different ways can be really, really powerful. And that may not necessarily have anything to do with the sport itself or the training experience or performance on Saturday, but what else is required in this group to create a sense of belonging. And I think that's really the piece that we need to reach for, is how can I create a sense of belonging for everybody that's involved in this group, and parents are a crucial piece. So.
Absolutely. I also want to go to Ben's question. Craig, it might be one for yourself or me to even answer, given that we're on the ground in New Zealand. But he's talked about the Balance is Better philosophy. How well is that being implemented on the ground by sports clubs, schools, and coaches? And I guess we're both lucky to be around the space at times. And the question really is around advice that you would give to parents and athletes regarding competing expectations, especially when playing multiple sports. So for me, I think there are certain people who possibly misinterpret the message at times. And I think there are certain people that are really trying to live the message. And I would just encourage those children to continue to play multiple sports. And the question I would ask them is, what's best for the child? Now, if the demands are too high across multiple sports at some point, that can be a challenge. But where would you start on this one, Craig? Because the philosophy has such great intent and so many positive messages, but it's important that it's interpreted correctly and then lived. And no doubt there's still a tension between demands of school and club sport or multiple sports, as Ben's alluded to.
Absolutely, Dave, and I think it's a great question, Ben, because we do need to talk to it, and I would suggest that whenever we think about change in any domain, then we can affect that change in many different ways. And system change is slow. Like that's the reality of the world that we live in, right? So we need to understand that it's going to take some time, and we're probably not going to see the changes right in front of us straight away. And those changes are going to take some time, and so we can look for other ways of helping the different stakeholders to move through some of these struggles that are definitely still out there. There's definitely still a lot of struggle, and one of them, as you mentioned, is the expectations on our young people. And so my work and the space that I spend a lot of time in is bottom up. So Sport New Zealand doing a great job from top down, but that's going to take some time. And then we can all work from bottom up. And one way we can think about that is to empower our young people. And again, it's not an overnight fix, but what we can think about doing is talking about some of the issues. And I think very much about information is powerful. And so if we can talk around some of these issues, and if we can suggest some things that they can try, and then be patient with them, then perhaps over time they're going to grow the skills and the abilities to deal with these types of conflicts. And this is the beautiful thing about sport, is if we think about it as a way to develop young people, then these tensions can be an opportunity. And I think that's where we need to go is kids are going to get expectations in all parts of life. And yes, we've got some work to do in the sporting arena, but where's the opportunity, right? Like how can we reframe it to go, this is an opportunity to help this young person grow as a human, and creating space. Like, I think that's the main thing we need to do, is create space in the hour or two that we have for our kids to actually talk to some of these things, as opposed to doubling down on the techniques and the tactics of the game. For sure. Because that's the only way that we're going to help our young people to really navigate some of these tricky situations.
Yeah, very nice. It's a complex topic. I want to push things along to reducing parental anxiety. We touched on unification and collaboration as part of this. I'm going to kick this off with a story. We all agreed prior to this that we'd share something, and we talk about the coach as a leader and the impact of that. I remember working in a professional academy environment in the UK, where obviously there is a huge amount of anxiety for parents, and there is a lot of pressure on these children, and at times they are selected far too soon. It's something that never sat overly well with me. But I remember a story of a player who was really struggling to grasp something tactically and was playing in a position as part of their individual plan to help them learn the game. And this particular player had a really overbearing dad. He was one of those guys who was really, really nice and always overly friendly and super interested in his son's development. But at times you were sort of questioning, some integrity there and some challenges. And what was never in question was how much he cared for his son. And the instance that I recall is, is getting onto the grass with this player and literally standing next to him to help him understand the principles of defending as a centre back in the game of football. And when there's no pressure on the ball, we can afford to step forward. And if there's pressure on the ball, we can step forward. And if there's no pressure on the ball, we might need to be on our back foot. And the dad spoke to me afterwards and talked about the impact that direct line of coaching had on him. And then we started to break down some barriers. Obviously, the child had benefited from the intervention, but we started to break down some barriers around why this guy was so stressed and why he was so anxious. And it was essentially fear of release from a program, fear of deselection. And the guy broke down. He was really upset, and he started revealing how much he cared and how much he was on top of this process all the time. And we're saying, you need to trust us and trust the program. And the kid stayed in the program for a very long time. So it was one of those where it was really revealing when you see the sense of desire to get involved and anxiety on the sidelines. Have you guys got either thoughts on that or similar, I guess, ideas around how you can sort of break it down and really sort of try and get past the exterior at times of the parent who's really trying to be overbearing because they care, but perhaps they're steering their kid to a point where the kid's paralyzed and isn't really learning because they're so worried about what's going on that side of the pitch?
I've got another story that shed lights on this idea, and I got an invitation to sit down with a family, and they had a few different kids, and one of the boys was a motocross rider, and this young fella was starting to experience some performance anxiety around turning up, and he was young, he was 12 years of age, and he was turning up on the weekends. And if you know anything about motocross, most of what happens is within a performance context. So funnily enough, there's a lot of these riders don't actually just get on their bike and go and ride with their mates with nobody watching, which is another story. We need to increase the amount of time that kids are spending learning. But in this particular sport, it's a lot of performance. And so this particular dad, he did come down on his boy quite a lot. And as you described, Dave, he was how we would suggest is slightly overbearing. And so I think we can spend time helping parents to dig into some of their stories, because I know I always go there first. It's like, let's talk about some of your experiences as a young person playing sport. And it turned out that he grew up in South Otago, and his dad drove trucks and was never around during the week. And then Saturday morning, dad would be home, and there was 4 boys, and all the boys would get in the car, and dad would take them off to rugby. And what it is for, it goes back to that question in the minds of this dad was, we're going out to win. This is what rugby is for. It's a competition, and therefore the outcome is the most important thing. And so his entire childhood was spent growing up around this narrative of sport is for winning. And when we grow up around these things, that's the beliefs that we hold, and we pass them down to our kids. And so, but when you can spend time just understanding parents' stories, then it gives you opportunity to talk into them and to provide alternatives, and just to really understand what it is that they need to create better environments for their boys. So I think, again, it's really valuing the job that can be done around those conversations and then creating space. And that's not an easy thing to do. Coaches are time poor, and we don't see our athletes and our kids for long periods of time. But I think it is a matter of just prioritizing this, creating space, and I think we can have a really big impact.
And what about you, Reed?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. So I was at a club in back here in the States in Ohio that high pressure, high stakes, a lot of national league teams, a lot of kids getting college looks. We're talking really, really high performance group. And with it came high performance parents who were type A personalities, very driven, very successful in their own lives, and similar concept. They really saw sport as winning, and they wanted their kids to win. And I became the one in the club. I was a director coaching that all the other directors would call and say, I got this parent I need you to sit down with, Reed. And one day, one of them said, you're the fixer. You're the one that talks to the parents. You're the parent whisperer. And I was like, well, I want to explain something to y'all. I'm going to just break down for you what I do. I listen. I don't dismiss them. I don't tell them that, let me do my job. You stay on your side of the field and keep your mouth shut. What's your issue? Why are you having this issue? And like Craig said, I have these conversations to find out a little bit more about them. And a lot of times they just want to be heard. They just want to be a part of it. They're a lot of times they insert themselves where they think they can, because we haven't given them a role to play. We haven't included them, like we talked about from the beginning, in this experience. And so the parents are just standing on that sidelines thinking that they're just supposed to be there to keep their mouth shut. So they'll just start inserting themselves into the conversation until you give them a role, or you invite them into this in more meaningful ways. And then they want to learn from you as well, because they've made a new connection with you, because you listened to them, you had empathy, and you heard their story. I did it when I was very young. I was coaching this team. I was probably 21 at the time, and I was the head coach. But a dad who'd coached the team for 3 or 4 years prior to me, he was my assistant, right? We knew who the real coach was. He was just letting me, he was letting me ease into it. But we get a couple games into the season, and I've got this keeper, and he's like Timmy Howard was back in the heyday, man. Yeah. He'd stand on his head and make saves from anywhere. He was saving the world, And then we get third or fourth game, and he's like a sieve. The balls are just going through his legs, and he's not even diving. And I turned to my coach and I said, "What's going on with the keeper? He's a different person." He says, "Look behind the net." And the dad is camped out right behind the net, and he's in his kid's ear the whole time. And I said, "Well, Bill, the assistant coach, Bill, what do we do?" He goes, "No, what do you do? You need to have a conversation with that parent." I said, "I'm only like 20 something. He said, "No, you need to have a conversation with that parent." Well, as it turns out, just explaining to that father the difference it made for him to be on the sideline enjoying the game versus in his son's ear, and how much his son just wants so badly to show him how good he is, that if he just releases it for a minute and lets his son enjoy the moment, it can change everything. And it was a life-changing conversation for me as a 20-something to have to confront a parent about it. But he just wanted to be heard. He wanted a little bit of direction. Yeah.
It's almost an awakening at times. And I think at times as coaches and, administrators in sport, you can often just by default get frustrated. But I think you've got to, as you said, Reed, show that empathy and understand, as Craig alluded to, really get into the details as to why they are that way and listen. I think there's a real responsibility, whether you are a coach or administrator in a club or school, to make sure they're heard, because it can be really hard and it can be really challenging to have these conversations so regularly. Craig, I want to go back to you on sort of, the narrative around nonlinear development. We know that player development, athlete development is never in a straight line. There's a lot of challenges that go there. And I think coaches can often be the driver of that narrative shift. And again, informing parents, bringing them to the table as to what they're seeing. Have you got any thoughts on this? Obviously the importance of understanding it. And then secondly, how we can ensure that we are collaborating to make sure that people are aware of this process.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in life, we walk into particular environments and we put a particular hat on. And oftentimes we don't take a moment to actually consider whether it's the right hat. And sport is an interesting place because it's so emotionally volatile that very quickly you can get drawn into saying and doing and being someone that, when you reflect on it, it's not really the person that you want to be. And I have these conversations with parents all of the time. Is, man, if I was to video someone on the sideline and then show it to them later, that's not the person that they want to be. And so it's a really interesting space to be. And what I've come to learn is that a lot of these things around development and the messiness of what happens, particularly during early adolescence, parents know.
Yeah.
Like they totally get it. And they understand that, their 12-year-old boy who's just grown 3 inches in the last 6 months, like he's struggling. And it's probably because he's trying to drive a brand new car, right? So to speak. And so it's less about having to introduce new ideas and just creating opportunities to speak to these ideas in moments that are emotionally stable, right? So talking to parents on the sideline, that's not a place where I believe education needs to happen, unless as Reed referred to, like it's a conversation that is important in the moment for the safety or the well-being of the child. But again, just creating spaces where you can sit around and to talk to some of these ideas and just bring them up and help parents to see it in a slightly different light, I think is really, really powerful. And then, so it's less about education and more about connecting dots. And then all of a sudden it shows up and it gives parents an opportunity to actually change the way that they do things in the spaces that really matter, be it on the sideline, be it in the car ride home, those really important places.
Dave's on mute.
Fo, are you guys there?
Yeah, we've got you back now, Dave. You're on mute for a while.
All good. No, I was just saying that's so important to respect what parents know and to acknowledge the fact they're there with their kids all the time. And at times, again, when you're working, when you're in the grind of coaching, then at times you can sort of be quite dismissive of that. Reed, anything to build off on what Craig said?
I was just going to say, so Luther asked the question earlier about these experiences off the field, and they link in with what Craig was saying. We would do things like when we would do tournament trips, because it's a team sport and, it required travel. We would build in there these activities that we could all do as a group, or we would have cookouts, or we would tailgate during a tournament weekend where we were all together between games. It allowed us to manage the rest periods for the athletes and keep them, rested and focused and all of that. But more importantly, like Craig was saying, that's when we'd have those conversations. We'd all be sitting under a tent, out of the sun, chit-chatting between games, and parents would ask, well, why are you working on this? And why are you doing that? Or I noticed Johnny's doing such and such. And that's where we could have these really good conversations about what we were doing. And we were reinforcing the culture and the community. And it made emotions, as Craig alluded to, emotions were low. The stakes were low. So then these conversations really sunk in versus during a game, during the heat of the moment, after a game when a parent's upset because Johnny didn't get enough playing time or we lost the game. Those aren't the times to have these kinds of conversations because everybody's emotions are in the wrong place to have it. And so any chance you get to build these experiences with the parents and the athletes outside of the game itself really lends to the overall culture. The other thing I would do is I always send out a weekly newsletter to my teams. They're very short and sweet, but just to touch base with them all, to let them know this is what we've been working on. And these are some things I'm really excited about for the kids. And I was a geek. I scripted my practices, not just from the training perspective, but from the language perspective, because I was so worried about conveying enough in training that I could not speak as much during games and let the game day be their day, but have trigger words that I could just say one or two words and it would remind them of something we'd worked on during the week. And so I was very scripted. And so when I'd email, I'd say to the parents, this week we talked about finding feet. Ask your kids what finding feet is about. Or you'll see your kids trying to get to a space where their teammate can see both feet so they can make a good pass to them. They won't hide behind defenders. And it was things like that. And then during games, the beauty is now the parents are now helping instead of just like shoot the ball or boot the ball, Jimmy, or, my mom yelled pass interference, American football. She yelled pass interference, whether my brother's team was on offense or defense, but now instead of that, they're actually calling out the things that we'd been working